All right, it's time for part 2 of my data update. This is a different kind of data update because I'm going to be sort of interpreting an article. I like this article. Like any article, it only has so many words before people start to lose attention. And there's a couple things that I noticed that weren't really highlighted by the author that I want to interpret for you from my standpoint. The article is called Know the Risks, and so I'd also like to say something about the risks makes me see some areas that are safe. And I'd like to talk about those as well. The risks, know them, avoid them. Hopefully you've seen this article. If you haven't, please go find it and read it first. It's much more important than anything I'm going to say, and it's based on that. 12-minute read, there you go. But the thing that this article says is that assuming we have just crested in deaths at 70K, it's possible that we lose another 70,000 people. That's what's going to happen with a lockdown. Without a lockdown, people are going to go out and that number is going to go up. My interpretation of this is, yes, I agree with this. And it's kind of like, is the glass half full or half empty? We're only halfway through, is what this author is saying. I'm going to say, hey, we're halfway through. We're going to make it. And that's the thing that we have to realize. Also, as we move into the future, people are going to be taking some kinds of risks. What are the risks that are right to take? The article emphasizes the places where people got infected. What I want to emphasize is the places where people didn't get infected and the other ways to talk about this. All right, and if you notice there's a little glitch in the matrix right there, it's allergy season. And so I'm having the symptoms. I know that these symptoms are not usually associated with COVID-19. I'm not worried. I know it's allergies for me. But I know my own risks. I know my own body. I know how I respond to grass pollen, for example. The one thing that I want to point out about this article is one of the things it starts with is this graph. In the last data update, I talked about how this graph is completely true, but can be misinterpreted if you're wanting to say the rest of the United States is on a plateau as opposed to a bunch of localities, some of which are getting worse, some of which are getting better. It's a whole mix. I want you to look at your own state and see how it's doing. And there's actually tools that I've talked about that allow you to do that. So when I add it up, I say, what can I do? I'm going to vote with my feet. What is safe for me when we're allowed to go out? And I think that this is key to the whole thing. We need to be informed. We need to look at the data. We need to realize that everybody seems to be spinning this data one way or the other. Try to look past the spin and look at your own situation. Am I high risk? And so, what is safe? Outdoors is actually very safe. I want people to be looking at outdoor people, and yes, there's a possibility of transmission. There's a 1 out of 318 cases of transmission. It's very important for people to realize. That's a big sample number, and that says something really substantial about the risks of transmission. The other things in the article that you may have noticed, the indoor restaurant in China, the Canadian Hockey League, they showed significant contagion. And the Korean call center also showed significant airborne contagion indoors. So this is very infectious, and there is significant contagion indoors. It's always on the matter of hours and in smaller spaces as opposed to larger spaces. The more you're like outdoors, the lower your risk of contagion is. So I want to think something that I noticed, and this is an inference. Believe me if you want to, okay? Believe me if you look at the data and see the same thing. But I believe that it showed that the bathrooms are not the major sources of infection for that call center. And so that means if we have cases like a drive-in theater that has to open bathrooms, I believe that that's relatively low risk. If you have to go to the bathroom at a drive-in theater, yes, there's aerosolized viral particles, but we had a case where I think the evidence shows that it's lower risk. And I want to show you what that means. The other thing that is risky, and this is one that really hits home for me, because I'm in a choir. I met my wife originally through singing in our choir. And singing is not safe because it produces these droplets that carry it. But even in the singing and church-related eating type things that showed a lot of transmission, I want to say the age risk is consistent with these. There are the different cases I mentioned before, the Skagit Chorale. 45 out of 60 were infected for a 2.5-hour choir practice on the size of a volleyball court. That's actually pretty packed together, by the way, for 60 people to be on the size of a volleyball court. 2 of them died, which is that's a high number. And I was wondering how that number would be so high. The average age of that choir was 67. There's one that just came out about a Calgary church birthday party and a get-together. Again, a couple of hours, 41 people together. Half of them, more than half of them, got infected. And even with taking precautions and being careful, not like, hugging each other and kissing and stuff like that. 2 of those died. And I was looking for the ages for that. The only thing I could find, one was 81 years old, and the other one was not reported. I think it's really important to report the ages because we need to know if we are a certain age that really impacts our risk of death. Not risk of hospitalization, by the way. This is still serious. But we want to say that the irreparable harm is definitely caused when you have a case where someone dies. And so I want to say, are you at high risk or not? And what are the risks that you have to weigh? By the way, there's other churches in Singapore. I'm going to show you a Twitter thread that also included churches. And it seemed that those churches actually had lower rates of transmission that implied more contact. The thing I don't want us to do is to cherry pick the worst cases of church transmission and then to say we need to shut down all the churches. We need to look at things like the thread that has the churches in Singapore that showed that there wasn't as much transmission in those cases. We don't know some of the good that's out there. Everything that I've seen, everywhere that I've seen it, says that this disease is very safe for age 1 to 17. Even that term is, of course, relative because this is a nasty disease, very bad for the older end of the age spectrum. But at least we don't have to worry about the kids. Even in New York City, I believe the numbers of New York City 1 to 17 that died were 9 out of millions and millions. So that's actually looking like the virus is sparing the young. And we need to think about that as we move forward. There's also some cases in that thread. So I want you to look at this thread. I want you to look at more than just that one article. Because I think that there are some studies that show not just where people were infected, but where people were not infected, where people did not get sick, where people did not die. We don't know the extent of that yet. So the risk factors that you need to watch out for to assess your own risk. Age is probably number 1. Obesity is very high. Diabetes, I've talked about this on other. I have friends in the medical profession who have said, I've seen this happening. Cancer is also a big underlying risk that I've seen, a comorbidity. But of course, even that is a big word. Cancer covers a lot of different conditions. The interesting thing, asthma is not a risk. And I just saw one sentence about this, so I haven't seen the proof of it. But I want to be talking about the cases that we've seen where there are people that are not at risk as opposed to at risk. This is the way that the Calgary church was reported. And it's looking at one story. I want to focus on the numbers. I want to see what they did as a church and what would be high risk. They had food. They tried to distance, but it wasn't successful. So it's clear that you can try and not succeed to keep it from passing over. And that can cause a lot of regret. I do want to say, if you end up taking a risk and it ends up not doing, being on the bad end of that risk, if somebody gets sick or hospitalized, that's the way it is with plagues. We can lower our risk, but we cannot eliminate it. And so I would do anything for a do-over. That's incredibly true. At the same time, what are the risks of inaction? What are the risks of not letting any churches get together under any circumstances? I want to find out what the circumstances are, and I want to lower that risk and realize also that risk can never be eliminated, and that's all we can do. We don't have perfect knowledge of the future, but we can look at cases like this, and we can have a do-over. We can be very careful about having food at events. That's one thing I take away from this. So all I'm saying is, look at a lot of cases. Look at more than just one case. Each newspaper article is a tragedy. It is one tragedy among, honestly, thousands. And there are many different kinds of tragedy. This is why I want to recommend for anybody who liked that article, I want you to find this Twitter thread by Dr. Sevick that includes a lot of cases that I had seen individually, but it's really powerful to bring these together and to say, okay, I believe this is number 15, so there were 14 cases before this summary. If you don't want to go through those cases, then you can actually just take her summary for words. And the studies all indicate close and prolonged contact is required. That means enclosed environments, indoors with low ceilings, being in a household, being in a long-term care facility, and being on public transport have been shown to do this. Close contacts is likely the key driver of productive transmission. So, people out on the beach, even if they're close, I wonder how high of a risk they are. Because the volume that you're talking about a virus that is moving through the air, through droplets suspended in the air. And also the amount that you get on you matters. If you get a little virus on your hand and wash it off, that doesn't get into you. It's breathing it in, it's getting it into you. Clearly, when you have something like the choir practice, you have high transmission and more than half of the people catch the virus. But also clearly, there's the age risk and the comorbidities are part of the equation as well. I want to give everyone the freedom to look at your own situation. You know yourself. And also, don't pass judgment on somebody else who's gauging their own risk. If you think that you need to stay home for as long as you can, and we need to have policies that will allow you to do that. That's another piece of the puzzle. But again, I'm not talking about policy here. I'm talking about how do you gauge your personal risk. This is the most important one, because this doesn't study just one outbreak. This studies 318. Now, these are in China, and they were in the January through February time. So there was a lot of people forced to be indoors in China, although I believe this covered many areas, so that this wasn't just Wuhan. This was a lot of different places. And the largest scope was that they studied 318 outbreaks, 1,245 cases. 2 of those cases were involved outdoor transmission. There was 1 outdoor outbreak out of 318. That is 0.16%, which rounds up to 0.2%. That means outdoor risk is low. This is what you want to look at. Now, it's possible, I don't know what the percentage of mask wearing was. I don't know what the percentage of people that were outside, but there were definitely people that were outside. There were people that were on public transport because public transport was the second most dominant category. People pass this to their families. People pass this to the people living in the same space as them. Even an office case, they do pass it. But I want to show you something about how that works. Now, the big factor in this is medically, are we talking about droplet transmission or aerosol transmission? I've been very careful about this, and I want to take the signs of aerosol transmission seriously. And I've looked at them, and I think that there's the transmissibility of it means that there is some low aerosol transmission, which is nasty and scary and means that we should be careful, and maybe in some cases the 6-foot rule might not be sufficient. But also it looks like that aerosol transmission has to build up for a while to become truly dangerous. That means that there's a bunch of doctors, and this is a group of doctors who are in the area in Toronto that got together, and what they're doing is they're based on what they've seen for the hospital transmission patterns. They say that they've seen transmission all in cases where there's droplets. And so the risk of aerosol transmission is lower than we may have been worried about. Honestly, I'm still a little worried about it. And so, but I do think that majority transmission is droplets. Medical procedures that produce droplets should be very careful with. We need to make sure PPE is all in place, and we need to do everything we can. But that's what they're saying. They're saying from our anecdotal sort of place, but a lot of anecdotes. And I think that I want to take their perspective seriously. I also want to take the high transmission that was shown in this very seriously, because we have a lot of transmission that can happen. Clearly, so I think that there might be some low-level aerosol transmission. But it's not the kind of thing where you can get it short of prolonged hour by hour cases. And that's why I think even if there is aerosol transmission some low level in a bathroom, I don't think you're spending hours in the bathroom. So I think bathrooms, I'm going to say this kind of guardedly, but I think bathrooms are relatively safe. I don't think we should be keeping drive-in theaters closed because of the risk of bathroom transmission. So you look at cases like this. This is the one thing that's been, this is like the big diagram for this whole article. This is a Chinese restaurant, and they have the airflow, and they see that all these other people got infected. But I want to notice a few things about this. First of all, small sample size, only 10 people. This is one outbreak, whereas the other study studied 318. This is indoors. This would have shown up. There's probably many other cases like this in the study, that the 318 study. But notice that out of the 10 people that were infected, 5 of them were in the same family as the index patient, as A1. And so they probably didn't catch it from sitting at that table. They probably catched it from living with A1, caught it. Now, with all that said, we still have 5 people who almost certainly caught it from the A1, or maybe it's the other family who are asymptomatic but infective at the time, and it was passed on through them. And so definitely it makes sense that there was some kind of droplet transmission. The flow of the air conditioning carried it over from the family of 5 to the family of 3 that were together, and they all caught it. Or maybe one of them caught it and passed it on to the others. So realize that these are 3 families sitting together. These are not 10 unrelated people. So you definitely have 2 transmissions here, not 10. Maybe you have more, but we don't know. The other thing about this is, if airflow is so important, then how in the world did C1 and C2 get it? Because the airflow is actually pushing the other way. In other words, we can't really dissect our location by airflow and say, hey, if I'm by the air conditioner, I'm safe, and the people downwind are in danger. It looks like maybe they got up and they walked around. Maybe there was a sneeze. Maybe there was a surface that they both contacted. I don't know. But you would say that C1 and C2 were safe by airflow in this case when they were not. They were in the same enclosed space. Somehow the virus got to them. Just remember, this is not really 10 cases. This is 2 definite transmissions in the restaurant. Maybe more. The Korean call center, this is the one thing I really want to point out, because this is both good news and bad news kind of things. All the blue that you see here are people that got infected. The infection started with one patient, and it spread to all these people. Very infectious. It also spread to these people over the case of a week. And there were a couple people on other floors that also got infected. Notice that most of these are on one side, and so that means definite respiratory droplet type transmission, and it got all the way through that even very large space. It had a week to do it, in which you had people working there for hours every day. The thing I noticed about this, and I love that they had a map here, because my question is, where are the bathrooms? By the way, 2/3 of the people there were women, and so they would be using the women's restroom. There are the bathrooms right there. The men's is on the side that got infected. The women's is on the side that did not. So therefore, 2/3 of these people, on average, are going to be women who got infected. And there are going to be 2/3 of the people would be crossing over to the women's bathroom. And over the week that everyone got infected, that bathroom must have been the source of some contagion, and maybe it was the source of the few people who got infected there. I don't know. The main thing to notice is the way that this is laid out. It implies that the shared bathrooms were not a driving factor in the spread of this disease. That's why I'm saying if there's a drive-in theater and there's people who are going to the bathroom, as long as you're not spending hours in the bathroom, even if there's a little bit of aerosol transmission, it looks like that is not a major factor in spreading the disease. These bathrooms, they would have had to cross the other side. The people on the bottom were sharing the bathrooms with the people on the top, and yet you did not have a major source of transmission through the bathrooms. That's what I conclude. This is all percentages and inferences. But I want to say, when you look at any of these things, there's a lot of detail that we have to see. Any summary is a summary. And there's details that we can look for to try to figure out. That's why I love science, because you can look for these things and find this. The other thing I've seen, a lot of those articles in the original, the anecdotes in the original article, they showed high transmissivity, high infectivity, which goes with the R naught of 3. But also I wonder, did any of these die? The average age is 40. Only 2 deaths were reported in the choir of 60 people, and the average age was 67, the upper age about 80. I could not find any other deaths reported in any of those cases. So I actually have been talking for a while. I'm actually going to break this into 3 parts because I have a little online meeting to go to right now. And so I will be back with more. Part 3 will be to come.